Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Tom Keating. I'm Director of RUSI's Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies here in London. It's my pleasure to introduce today's webinar. Before getting started, I would ask that you absorb the housekeeping points on the screen and note that the full webinar, including the Q&A section, is being recorded. If you want to ask a question, I think we all know how that works now, but do please pose it in writing in the Q&A box. And do please include your name and organizational affiliation to help give us and our guests today a sense of where you're coming from. Most of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with RUSI's Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies, but for those of you who are not, we established the program in 2014 with the aim of studying issues at the intersection of finance and security, threats that are global and cross-border in nature, as we will certainly hear much more about today. So again, welcome to those of you who are just joining. My name is Tom Keating, and today we are delighted on the eve of Global Anti-Corruption Day to be hosting Tom Burgis, investigations correspondent at the Financial Times, and importantly, as it is a topic of today's discussion, author of the recently published Kleptopia, How Dirty Money is Conquering the World, a copy of which I can say should be under every Christmas tree in a couple of weeks' time. I'm also delighted to welcome Alexandra Rage, founder and president of Trace and host of the Must Listen podcast for those interested in financial crime, bribe, swindle, or steal, who will lead our discussion today with Tom. Alexandra, you're very welcome. That's all you're going to hear from me for now. I may get involved in the Q&A, depending on what happens. But all I will say at this point is do please post your questions in the Q&A box. Tom is very keen to hear from as many people as possible. And to thank and welcome once again, Alexandra and Tom, for joining us today. So Alexandra, over to you. The floor is, as they say, yours.
Thank you so much. Delighted to be here and to be talking about this fantastic book with Tom. Let's jump right in. I think the time is going to fly by. Tom, in your book, you say that the majority of the world's citizens live in kleptocracies, which was just a fascinating comment to read. And it makes me think that we should perhaps start by backing up a little bit and having you describe what you mean by kleptocracies and, of course, Kleptopia.
Well, thank you, Alexander. Thank you, Tom. Thanks to RUSI, and thanks to everyone for tuning in. I'm only sorry we can't be in a huge room together, but it's excellent to be talking about this. So what is kleptocracy? Corruption is everywhere and always has been and always will be. The abuse of public office, or sometimes put the abuse of public trust for personal gain. The simple difference between a system that's a kleptocracy and one that isn't is whether or not corruption is the aberration or the system itself. When corruption becomes the system through which power works, then that system has become a kleptocracy. The purpose of it is for the enrichment of those who hold power. That's its primary purpose. Kleptopia is the emerging transnational alliance, if you like, of kleptocracies and kleptocratic networks, and I think it's important to make that distinction. I noticed there's the question that's already in the Q&A about the complicity of Western states. I think sometimes we fall into a trap of thinking that there are kleptocrats that live in, very hot or very cold countries with where we can't pronounce people's names, and people have cultures we don't recognize, and those are the kleptocracies. And then there are the democracies, the rich countries, which are somehow sort of occasionally polluted by those kleptocrats and their money and their lobbyists. And it's certainly true that the kleptocratic rulers are desperate to swathe themselves in the legitimacy that the democracies offer or generate. But it's also true, and this is the idea of Kleptopia, that these are really networks that don't have any regard to borders. Yes, they capture and subvert state institutions, whether that is a London court or the Russian treasury or the Nigerian military. Yes, they seize and use these state institutions, but these are truly global networks seeking to capture power and privatize it. and they are global. And that is Kleptopia, as described in the book in 4 riveting stories that, as Tom rightly says, belong under every Christmas tree and in every Christmas stocking.
Absolutely. Just now you're talking about networks, and in the book you talk about nodes. That's almost too sanitized a word. It's sort of a roiling snake's nest of
Yeah.
activity. But you tell the stories with such extraordinary clarity. I want to give you an opportunity to tell some of those here. And the one that I found most compelling, or they're all compelling, but the most moving perhaps, was the story of Rosa. Can you talk us through Rosa's experience?
Absolutely. So Rosa's story is one of the most harrowing I've ever reported on, and I reported on it from Kazakhstan, from Zhanaozen and the area around there. Zhanaozen, a place in the steppe near the Caspian Sea, in the extreme west of Kazakhstan, near where Kazakhstan's oil and gas is to be found. And I don't know how many people on this call will have ever been to Zhanaozen, but it's a truly godforsaken place. It's in a pretty inhospitable part of the world, and I don't think anyone would reasonably consider living there were there not masses of oil and gas beneath. So the town of Zhanaozen is one of the kind of spigots of the global oil economy that keeps the Kazakhstan's regime afloat. And one of the people who lives there is Rosa Tulatieva. Now, Rosa was one of the state oil company workers who went on strike in 2011 over it was a wages dispute, but also over corruption in the management of the state oil company. And Rosa has let's say, a personality that has a sort of instinctive distrust of authority, and she pushes herself to the front, and she makes her moral indignation known. So Rosa was one of the people who maintained this strike over many months in a vigil in the main square in Zhanaozen, essentially standing up to a kleptocratic regime. And then she and her fellow strikers discovered how kleptocratic regimes respond to such challenges. The security forces opened fire on Independence Day in 2011, murdering about a dozen of the strikers. But then what followed, I think, gives us a real insight into how kleptocratic systems work, because then what happened was the doctoring of the public record. So just as we see money laundering with dirty money, so we see the laundering of fact, if you like. This is, for me, why it's so important to understand kleptocracy and kind of the post-truth fake news era as two sides of the same thing. So how do you go about changing the public record from a massacre conducted by state security forces to unrest and looting provoked by violent protesters? Well, you have to get confessions, generally, is how these things are done. And you have to have a kind of court record that you can lean on and you can offer as the official record. Now, the courts are utterly pliant in Kazakhstan, and they do what they're told. And that was evidenced in the Zhanaozen trial by this heavily perspiring judge handing out ludicrously long sentences. But in order to get those all-important confessions, what you have to do is some torturing. This is typically what kleptocrats do. So I just wanted to read you. Can I read you just one paragraph?
Yeah, please do.
Because I think it's very important for us to remember as well. Tom and you and the brilliant work you do on kleptocracy is so important in getting into understanding the financial machinery. But we must always remember, I think, to come back to the human cost. So this is one moment of the human cost for Rosa Tulatieva, who's she's a single mother in her middle age, a remarkable woman. Men in plain clothes walked Rosa into the detention center and down a corridor with doors leading off on each side. They led her to what she took to be a commander's office. There, she was shown a list of her relatives. She was questioned again and again, men shouting at her, but she didn't understand what answers she was supposed to give. One of the men had a scar on his face and a malevolent air. Ruslan was his name. He came towards her carrying a plastic bag. He whipped it over her head and pulled it tight. She gasped for air, but none came. At last, Ruslan released the bag. Rosa felt her head swim. Then suddenly, the bag was back on, her body writhing in panic. Again, Ruslan asphyxiated her, and again and again. When the bag split, he went off to find another. His colleague took over. He slapped Rosa's face, grabbed her neck. He seized a fistful of hair and dragged her from her seat. When they took her back to her cell, she tried to tidy herself. As she composed her hair, a clump of scalp came away in her hand. Then the torture of Rosa continues in unimaginably awful ways. And then they threaten her daughter. They threaten to bring in and rape her daughter. And then this is how the story continues. Rosa would have done anything to protect her daughter. She wanted to protect everyone. Others could betray her if they needed to, if it would keep them out of here. By any means, by truth or lie, let them not end up here, she thought. She would have done anything, but she did not know what it was she was supposed to do, to say. What had happened, she thought. And that, I think, is Rosa's almost painfully naive position, is that the facts stand by themselves and can't be manipulated by those in power, which I think tragically they can, and that is part of understanding what kleptocracy and kleptopia are.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. And your earlier point that although we're talking about systems of theft and power, the individuals are the most compelling stories in so many ways, because that's, of course, what this comes down to. But let's shift now back to the power structure. And if you could explain for us the story of Nazarbayev, and specifically, let's take the portion where he is speaking at Cambridge.
Right. So when that massacre happened, and yes, you're right too. It's something I try to do in the story, is to show the sort of interweaving of ordinary lives, for want of a better word, with the lives of the powerful. So a few months after, when that massacre happened, Nazarbayev was due to come to Cambridge and give a speech. It was going to be this big set piece. He'd had years and years of being dogged by the Kazakhstan scandal. So that goes back to some of the earliest years of his dictatorship in Kazakhstan, where he was discovered to have received millions and millions into a Swiss bank account from the beneficiaries of an oil deal in which Mobil of the US received a big oil concession in Kazakhstan. So this had been a huge problem for Nazarbayev, and he'd employed all sorts of PRs and spies to try and make this go away. And eventually it had. It's an extraordinary story, one I tell in the book. But by 2011, by the time of the massacre, Nazarbayev is repairing his reputation and trying to do what all kleptocrats try to do, which is present a face that can be embraced by the democracies, because that's one of the things that money can't buy, is the embrace of that legitimacy. I mean, money goes a long way to securing it, but you also have to be able to present yourself plausibly, or sufficiently plausibly for Western leaders or democratic leaders to be able to keep a straight face during that embrace. Hence the PRs, hence the spies, hence the using of the courts to target your enemies and so on. So Nazarbayev has a problem in that he's due to give this big set piece speech in Cambridge, and this is just straight after the financial crisis. This is when power is moving almost visibly from west to east, and there is Nazarbayev is coming from the fulcrum of Central Asia between China and Russia, coming to Cambridge to sit beneath a portrait of Elizabeth I and give this speech. But then trickily enough for him, he has to contend with this massacre. And who does he turn to? He turns to one of the great communicators of the West in recent years, Tony Blair, who's been doing some work in Kazakhstan, as he has since the end of his premiership in lots of places where he's made a great deal of money. And Blair gives Nazarbayev a lesson in how to frame what is essentially a massacre followed by a campaign of torture as an unfortunate episode in the otherwise visionary maintenance of stability, being the crucial word. It's one of those great image laundering words that we hear again and again from those who hold illegitimate power. And so with Blair's help, Nazarbayev crafts the speech, and off he goes to London, to Cambridge, and delivers it. You can still, the speech is still, there's clips of the speech on YouTube, and you can still, there's a link, there's a URL for the actual text in the back of the book, which has been deleted from the whichever Kazakh website it's on, but you can still find it. And it really is an extraordinary moment when of image laundering, the political parallel to money laundering. And I won't read you the scene now, but I hope I managed to convey in the book something of the sort of Alice in Wonderland quality of what happens. And it's just one example of a process that's happening every single day, which is as I say, the sort of personal image laundering, the laundering of power, if you will, to go alongside the laundering of money.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. And one of the great challenges about discussing this book is it is so dense, not only with extraordinary research, but with storytelling. And so in our 3 vignettes, I'm going to ask you if you can just shift for a moment, because this brings us right up to 2020 in many respects. If you could talk about, and he's in the book in a number of places, but hit some of the highlights for us with Felix Sater.
Yes, Felix Sater is one of the more extraordinary characters I've ever come across. I'm sure plenty of people listening will be familiar with him. Russian-born, Brooklyn-raised, trained in finance, worked in Manhattan and worked on Wall Street for a while, then smashed a margarita glass into a guy's face, went to prison, lost his ability to work in the legitimate finance, if you like, and so took up in illegitimate finance as a money laundering for a mafia-backed stock fraud. This is all still while he's still relatively young. Then goes to Russia, and during his time in Russia, he both develops contacts with Russian intelligence and is recruited by the CIA. Well, as recruited certainly by US intelligence, the CIA among them. That develops into a relationship later with the FBI, and Felix Sater does all sorts of extraordinary things, such as provide Osama bin Laden's phone numbers and so on. And he then becomes entangled in one of the great, I would argue, and I think you'd agree, phenomena of our time, which is the tidal wave of money coming out of the ex-Soviet kleptocracies into the West. One of the sort of transformational phenomena of our time. And Felix is the kind of guy who can connect these worlds. He understands them both, speaks the languages of them both, and he can channel money from the former Soviet Union into Western real estate, which is where that money likes to be parked. It's a favorite haven for money ripped from lawless places to be parked in places where it can enjoy the protection of the rule of law. Here's a little passage about Felix that will tell you why he's particularly important. When it came to picking winners, Felix Sater could be content that he had chosen the right Kazakhs. Felix done a bit of work with some Kazakhs whose money's being chased. Just like he had grasped how to yoke his own interests to those of the CIA and the FBI. Now an altogether more audacious bet was about to pay off. He wanted to be there to witness the moment in person. His taxi arrived. Hi, I'm not going to do a Brooklyn accent. I'd love to try, but it's just embarrassing for everybody. Hi, how are you? The driver said. Do you know who I am? Asked Felix. No, I don't really know you. Felix showed the driver a business card in order, the driver thought, to demonstrate that he was a VIP. They set off towards Midtown, across the bridge that linked his Russian roots in Brighton Beach to the Manhattan money man he'd become. He and the driver talked a little about the evening's remarkable events, but Felix spent most of the ride on the phone, speaking in Russian. They drove towards Central Park, a few blocks up from the bar where all those years ago the margarita glass in his hand had connected with a face that would need 100 stitches to close its wounds, the moment that had propelled him into this life of secrets. The car pulled up outside the Hilton. Felix had booked a room, but none of those present planned to do any sleeping. For nearly 3 hours, the excitement in the Hilton's ballroom mounted until the place was humming. It was as though from this boxy chrysalis on 6th Avenue, there was about to burst forth a thing of truth and beauty never before seen. At last, at 10 minutes before 3, it was done. The metamorphosis was complete. The ballroom filled with music. A fine American composition, the theme from Air Force One, a film scarcely less plausible than the exploits that had brought Felix to this point on this night, in which a crazed Russian nationalist holds a US president hostage. And then there he was, high up on the gantry, waving down to his people, the winner, the reality star, the man whose name had been the final, crucial ingredient in Felix Sater's magic potion for transforming dirty money, Donald J. Trump. So that's why we're particularly interested in Felix's story, and there's much more on Donald in the book.
Yeah, it's a great tribute to the book that you managed to just toss in at the beginning of that Felix Sater, among other things, provided phone numbers for Osama bin Laden to American intelligence. That's just a side story for most of this, but it's a good indication of how much you can find in this book.
Well, it's also an indication of how you can, and we can pick it up if anyone's interested, of how sort of kleptocratic networks and intelligence agencies sometimes get fused together.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And you talk about the alliance of kleptocrats. You group in that discussion Trump together with Duterte, Erdogan, Bolsonaro, and others. It's startling to some to read, I think. Do you mean that? What are the qualifications to be included in this club?
I do. I mean pretty much all of what I put in the book, I'd say. But there's an important distinction. I totally see your point. There's an important distinction. So there are two, if you like, alliances of kleptocrats that I'm talking about. One is very much literal and direct, conspiracies, alliances that connect the hidden kleptocratic business interests, connect the money flows between different kleptocracies. So a very good example is, I won't go into the whole thing here, but you can read it in the book, is the 2008 and 2013 re-elections of Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe. Two events that have combined to condemn Zimbabweans to another quarter of their meager life expectancy under that deeply oppressive and violent kleptocratic regime of Mugabe, and now his successor Mnangagwa, the crocodile, who also features in the book along with some of his friends. So just to take the first one of those, the 2008 election in potted form involves a Zimbabwean kleptocrat with the help of a white Zimbabwean tycoon extracting a platinum asset from a London-listed company, selling it on to various offshore vehicles through which it arrives at another London-listed company, which has received financial support from a Wall Street hedge fund, which has been showering bribes all over Africa. And then once that transaction delivers $100 million to Robert Mugabe, just as he's about to begin on the brutal campaign to steal the 2008 election, which was the nearest Zimbabweans have got to freedom pretty much in their lifetimes. The way that the business parties involved in this cashed out was with a deal, with a transaction, with a sale to a third London-listed company, this time one controlled by 3 former Soviet oligarchs who are very close to the Kazakh dictator. So there, in one set of money flows, you have concrete money connections knitting together different kleptocracies and the Western financial system. So those are the sort of solid functional networks I'm talking about. And then what you're referring to, I think, is something different. I'm talking when I write about Duterte, Maduro, Trump, I can't remember which of the other examples you picked, but it's that list, isn't it? Of
Erdogan, Bolsonaro.
Yeah, exactly. But I think Maduro is important to include as well, because ideology here is just a mask, really, and nationalism is just a decoy. Dangerous ones, admittedly. So in some cases, such as Trump and Putin, or Trump and Mohammed bin Salman, Trump and, let's say, the Kims in Pyongyang, in some cases these relationships develop into personal alliances, personal friendships. Who knows what business deals they may yet yield. But also, I'd say there's a broader alignment of interest. We talk about a community of democracies, don't we? A set of shared values trying to advance shared interests. There's a community of kleptocracies as well, which is trying to advance the privatization of power, for personal gain, and to use that kleptocratic power, to use that corruption to bolster that power. And so the circle goes on. And in that sense, these examples we're discussing are all part of that community of kleptocrats, in that is their shared endeavor. However much they may look like enemies, ultimately, like the 5 families in New York, ultimately they have more in common than divides them.
Okay, so, and they're all using the financial centers, and you talk about that a lot. So let me follow on with a very pragmatic question. If these financial centers, as you describe, depend to a great extent on dirty money, does that make reform of the sector a dead end? And this dovetails with a question as well. Banks are spending an enormous amount of money on compliance. Some would argue compliance theater. But if they are at the center of this and their business model depends on this money, I guess I'm asking you for any cause for optimism.
Yes, I think there's a few points in there, aren't there? I mean, compliance theatre is a good word. So there are, we should say, of course, there are, in the government of Kazakhstan, in the civil service of Kazakhstan, maybe it's better to put it, or in the banks of New York, or wherever it may be, there are, of course, brilliant people of good faith trying to grapple with difficult problems. I'm not trying to suggest a world of monsters, monstrous things that do happen notwithstanding. I would say, let's look at the suspicious activity report system. Mm-hmm. A chunk of which got leaked in those FinCEN files. I was talking to someone the other day who said to me, in the UK there are I think about 400,000 suspicious activity reports filed every year, and the bit of the National Crime Agency that's meant to deal with that has about, on any given day, about 25 people working, not just on the SARS, but they are in the department that handles the SARS. So obviously that's an utterly impossible task, and it suggests that the purpose of that system, deliberately or not, is to allow the impression of probity to be given to a system that is freely used by dirty money. I can't see any other interpretation of that set of facts. And it also tells you, and this is maybe something blindingly obvious, but it also tells you that banks proceeded with 400,000 transactions that they themselves had considered suspicious. This is one of the strange paradoxes of the SARS regime, isn't it? That what it does is, if anything, it makes it easier for a bank to go ahead with a suspicious transaction, because it says, well, we warn the regulators, we warn those 25 guys in that room that this and those other, and the rest of the 400,000 transactions were a bit dodgy, but they didn't say anything, so we're just going to crack on. I'd say that, and I'd be fascinated to hear what others what you or Tom or others on this call thought about this. For me, and and I'm obviously a reporter, not a policy expert or a lawyer, as you can tell. I would say that it all comes down to front companies. It all comes down to anonymity in the financial system. And we're coming at it from one approach, which is to massively increase the amount of information available. It looks like there's going to be a big breakthrough in beneficial ownership transparency in the US in the coming days. That's welcome, of course, but you just have to look at the Companies House website in the UK to see the farcical nature of a lot of the actual filing that goes on. And then even if we do get to the stage where beneficial ownership transparency is mandatory in maybe even everywhere, that is still an essentially impossible amount of information to process by man or machine in a meaningful way. So I'd say it might be helpful to look at the enforcement side of this. I mean, the way that corruption gets busted is by well-resourced prosecutors having time, money, and inclination to use their talents to crack open these corrupt schemes. And in every single one of them, if you go back and read all the DOJ records or the cases, the SFO cases and the cases in France and so on, they've all got a front company in the center of them. And that's the fiction that lies at the heart of the global kleptocracies, the idea that money moves through the world separate from human volition, that companies are doing things. It's a legal fiction that's been vital to the growth of capitalism, but this is the monster it's created. So I'd argue that you just have a strict liability whereby if you do business with a front company and that transaction is shown to have been corrupt or shown to have enriched an official, you will be treated as if you knew. You would be treated by the law as if you knew, in the same way that if you speed in a car, it doesn't matter if your friend is in the backseat giving birth, it's a crime. If you don't declare some of your income on your tax return, it doesn't matter if you were at your kid's school play and you got distracted, that's a crime. I would say that undertaking corrupt transactions with front companies, we have to start treating in the same category, because it is that plausible deniability that financial anonymity creates that is the absolute heart of the kind of the mechanics, the functioning of Kleptopia.
Yeah, in your speeding analogy, anonymous companies are almost the equivalent of blaming the car for the speeding, rather than the pregnant friend in the back seat. This anonymized, inhuman actor in all of this. It's easy in the face of really well-financed global power to feel a bit feeble, and it's reflected in the questions that a lot of people are asking: what can be done? And your comments about beneficial ownership for companies, a registry, I think is really important. There's a question as well about the role of journalists, and a couple of questions. One, how you went about your work on this book, which I think everybody would be fascinated to hear. And then also the role of journalists going forward. You've mentioned prosecutors, but so much of this comes to light because of the good and often dangerous work of reporters. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, maybe I'll just say a quick bit about how I went about it, and then a quick bit about journalism more broadly. Would that be
yes,
good?
Please.
Yeah. So for me, this started just after I finished my last book, my first book, my only other book, The Looting Machine, which is about the oil and mining industry in Africa and the corruption and conflict it creates. In fact, Tom very kindly had me an event for an event at RISI a few years ago about that. Also, excellent stocking filler, and we did and there was another event about that book at the Frontline Club, War Correspondents Club in London, talking about corruption. At the end of it, a guy in his 50s, balding, in a sort of frilly shirt, put his hand up and said, "Well, hello, interesting to hear about corruption. I used to work in a Swiss bank, and I can tell you there was a lot of corruption going on there." To which I thought, okay. And we got chatting to this guy afterwards at the bar, and his name was Nigel, and he is the main character in Kleptopia. You have to read the book to find out what happens with him. But he set me off on a trail that led back to some of the places I'd covered in Africa, especially the great repositories of natural wealth that are the engines of corruption, Congo especially, and Zimbabwe. But then also off into the former Soviet Union. So this book really, and then actually the trails to the former Soviet Union lead you back to Trump's Washington, as we all now more fully understand. But it is an extremely difficult book to report. So the combination of source protection in Congo, Kazakhstan, Russia, and sadly increasingly in the UK, France, and the US, source protection is a very serious business and always has been. But it's these days when so much communication is digital, it's hard, you have to take extra care. There is also simply just more danger these days. One element of the book that I wrote up into a longer FT Financial Times story the other day was about 3 witnesses to the ENRC corruption case in the UK, the Serious Fraud Office's biggest corruption case, in which 3 Central Asian oligarchs and the UK's main financial crime body are up against each other, each accusing each other of wrongdoing. And 3 of the potential witnesses for this case are dead in suspicious circumstances. Now, we don't know how they died, but we know that they did die. And so we're now moving in a world where of those kinds of dangers. We're also moving in a world where journalists are now being murdered within the EU, which is something pretty remarkable. It's always been, and this must be stressed, it's always been so much harder and requires so much more courage for the journalists who live in Kazakhstan, Angola, Ukraine, wherever it may be. And those are the truly heroic journalists, and I think they would agree that even more heroism is shown by the anonymous sources, the people who, with very much without hope of recognition, take enormous risks to help this information become public. But all of which is to say that if you think this is work that can be conducted by a kind of one-person Twitter band, you're sorely mistaken. The degradation of the mainstream media is in some ways deserved. The mainstream media has done all sorts of bad behavior in recent years and let itself down in all sorts of ways, but we will miss it if it goes. My God, there is no other model for funding difficult, dangerous work that requires source protection, that requires I'm not alone in being a journalist who's worked in these places for ages, that have lost large chunks of my life to illness of one sort or another as a result of that work. And you need big organizations. I think we so often forget that what's really involved in having real investigative journalism, whether that be the brilliant investigative journalists in Nigeria or at the Financial Times or wherever it may be, what's really involved in this is a massive and incredibly difficult undertaking that gets very easily dismissed or lost in the sort of furore around the mainstream media. I mean, I could go on, as you can probably tell, but that's probably enough.
Really fascinating. And there's a follow-on question, I think, that is interesting as well, which is reactions to the book and how they vary by market, North America, Europe, elsewhere. Are you finding different reactions to the material in different countries?
Do you mean from readers or from the people who are in the book?
It's a question from a participant, and I think it was from readers of the book, but I've lost the question.
I'd say it's been pretty. I wouldn't say there's been a pattern by place. I would say that if there have been, the reactions range. Well, I really wouldn't say there's been a reaction that differs by place. It's like I'm very pleased to say it's being enjoyed, worldwide. Sounds a bit much, isn't it? But yes, all over the place.
I would expect that people drawn to a book like this are going to have more in common, regardless of the country they live in, than people who are drawn to a book about kleptocracy.
Well, yes. Although what I mean, I very much set out to write a book that would appeal to a keen reader of thrillers about to get on an airplane. I mean, there's a stylistic reason to write this book as it is, which is meant to be in the non-fiction novel mode, the mode that began with In Cold Blood by Truman Capote and you know, Michael Lewis does it wonderfully, and Barbara Demick does it wonderfully, and so on. There's a stylistic reason to that, which is that I think it's a wonderful genre and it's a wonderful way to read, but also because there's a more specific reason, which is that by forcing myself to write in the style of a non-fiction novel, I have to understand the characters, and that means you have to understand the human action, and that gets you past the big trap with a lot of the writing about corruption, which is that we get dazzled by what we're meant to be bewildered by, which is the front companies and the chicanery and the complexity. So I've tried my best to make this a book about people rather than a book about the mechanics of corruption, for the reason that brings us back to the central point, which is that however much they might try to pretend otherwise, corruption is always done by people themselves.
Yep. And you succeed in that spectacularly, but I am nevertheless going to ask you two mechanical questions, two questions about mechanics from the audience. The first one is about the beneficial ownership registry, and whether you think that it will have a real impact in and of itself. And the second is whether you have any comment on the use of cryptocurrency in fueling these kleptocratic networks.
Yeah, just the first one again. Cryptos was the second, and the first one was...
Yeah, the beneficial ownership registries. I guess the question is about how optimistic you are about the role that they can play to solve some of this. I think we're putting a lot of eggs in that basket.
I don't want to seem like I'm not saying that I think it's an extraordinary achievement to have created the political will to get as far as we've got with beneficial ownership registries. I'm just, I guess my concern would be that it doesn't become another version of suspicious activity reports, which, if we're honest, probably may do more to facilitate dirty money transactions than they do to stop them by in the ways that we've discussed. Now, is there a risk that something similar happens with beneficial ownership registries, that their existence allows more transactions to go unscrutinized? I think that risk is there because of the difficulties in policing the standards of information, enforcing the standards of information. As I said earlier, like the lesson of beneficial ownership transparency rules in London is that a lot of the information is just clearly nonsense. And it doesn't appear to be enforced. I think there are sanctions for filing nonsense, but as far as I know, that isn't being enforced. So just on their own merits, beneficial ownership registries have a lot more work to do. And I do feel that it's a parallel to what I was saying about, you know, well-funded mainstream media, well-funded news organizations, tigerish, aggressive, good legal departments, and so on. We need the same. All the institutions of democracy need that same invigoration. I mean, I've had one or two people get to the end of a book and be annoyed because it doesn't contain the sort of standard journalist 7-point plan to fix all the ills I've just diagnosed, which I always think is a complete cop-out and pointless. Like, why? I mean, ultimately, why do you care what I think about this? I do have some ideas because I've studied it so long, but my job is to report, and you know, and I've got my front company's idea, which I think is very important, and I'd like to raise these questions. But I also think that that the answers are completely obvious, and they're frustrating in that they're not some new policy silver bullet. Useful though tools such as beneficial ownership registries are, we know, because the whole of civilization is the pendulum between the concentration of power and wealth and the periods of the greatest spread of power and wealth, and then the concentration again. We know this from history, we know this from evolutionary biology, and we know that the way that power is challenged and spread more widely is through democratic institutions, or institutions that protect and promote the common good. And that, you know, that's parliaments, that's the free press, that's an independent judiciary, and so on, and reinvigorating those things, and reinvigorating civic duty is the task. We haven't got to we're not in doubt as to what the task is. We may be struggling to know about how to go about it, but it's right in front of us what we need to do.
Another question, and you do touch on this in your book. Do you think that government investigative bodies like the FCA are too close to financial institutions? That's the first part. And then
yes,
should they? Yes, that was easy. Should they look to develop relationships with civil society groups and investigative journalists? That's a bit trickier.
Yes, I mean, but again, I mean, you don't need me to tell you that they're funded by the banks. I mean, of course they're too close. The Nigel, who I mentioned earlier, is one of the main characters in the book and a wonderful man and a very brave whistleblower. You know, he worked for a while at the FCA, and he was just appalled by this sort of culture of regarding the financial services industry as the customer. You know, but by that and using that that noun. I mean, the job of the regulator is to, in any market, surely, is to uphold broader societal norms against the vested interests of that industry. Would be pretty much the definition of a regulator, isn't it? And if it's funded by the industry, can you imagine what we'd be saying now if the bodies considering giving approval to COVID-19 vaccines were funded by the pharmaceutical industry? There would quite obviously be outrage. I just think I think it's just, the funding and the setup of financial industry in the UK is farcical. And relationships with civil society and journalists. The financial regulators are civil society, aren't they? They are the representatives of civil society. That, I mean, the question contains part of the problem. They are our representatives in a market. Every regulator should be that. Every institution should be a representation of civil society. And as for relations with journalists, I mean, formal relationships between institutions and journalists are essentially just propaganda, aren't they? But I'm all for informal relationships between people in institutions and investigative journalism. And, you know, my number's on my website.
There's a question about trending. Do you see the situation in the UK getting worse, or are you optimistic about the direction that it's headed?
I think well, the clearest worry in the UK, isn't it? I would say would be the school that's pushing for Brexit to be used to make the UK into a sort of Singapore on Thames, and to try and use the really sort of make more explicit what the city already is, which is the hub of a network of offshore secrecy jurisdictions, which is, you know, chunks of the former British Empire, and to sort of rebrand Britain as a kind of low tax, low regulation money center. I think that would obviously just turbocharge the flows of dirty money into the UK, and I think would also advance subtler and maybe even more worrying trends that go alongside that. We often just focus on the money, but with the money obviously comes the legal fees and the school fees and so on. And we look at these things in terms of the illegitimate origins of the money, but there's also the effect on the launderee as well as the launderer. So, you know, you go to Chancery Lane and you look at the court cases playing out in the High Court that are injecting hundreds of millions of dollars each year into big British law firms, and those are, a lot of them are essentially kleptocratic power struggles. So power struggles playing out in British courts, and using the institutions of the rule of law to fight as I say, kleptocratic power struggles. And the other thread of that is the increasingly alarming clarity with which we see political donations from people, from big figures, from especially Russia, but also other big kleptocracies, into the Conservative Party and other political parties in the UK. I mean, it's astonishing. Can you imagine if Vladimir Putin casually allowed some of his biggest political donors to be people who used to be in MI6? Can you imagine how long that would be tolerated? in the Kremlin. But we seem to have become completely comfortable with that. It baffles me, to be honest, how that's happened. So yeah, there are causes for concern. I do think though that one one thing that might come out of the COVID pandemic is a broader appreciation of the dangers of corruption, because as we've been talking about, like there is one sort of standard kind of tabloid narrative of corruption, which is person who shouldn't have big yacht has big yacht, essentially, and we neglect the truly terrifying parts of corruption, which is the Chinese school that was where the contract was inflated and used to pay a kickback, and then that as a result the materials were substandard and the school collapsed, which is the example of the former compliance officer of Siemens. That's how he explains corruption. Or it's the dead witnesses I talked about earlier. I think because of the chumocracy, as it's kind of euphemistically called in the UK, and we see similar things in the US and elsewhere, because of this mad doling out of COVID-related contracts without scrutiny, without tender, often to ludicrous companies that were created 20 minutes earlier in Mauritius or whatever, and crucially to lots of politically connected business people. I think that's given us a much broader understanding of the damage that corruption can do, and the fact that this chumocracy, as it's called in the UK, has led to, it seems pretty clear, excess deaths, more deaths than there would have been had the situation been managed properly. And I think that might give us a wider sense. It might give more of society a sense of what corruption really means, and what it means when the norms of public service start to break down, and once they start to break down, how hard they are to restore. It's not too late for that to happen, but I think it might ring louder alarm bells for people considering what rules we want to impose on those we entrust with power, I guess.
Yeah. We have a question that has a circle back slightly to the alliance of kleptocrats. And the question is around distinguishing between kleptocrats in democracies and kleptocrats in authoritarian countries. They're all eating at the same trough, but presumably there's a difference in checks on their behavior. But in your book, you move back and forth between them pretty fluidly. So the question then, talk a little bit more about the distinction between Western democratic kleptocracies versus non-Western authoritarian kleptocracies.
Yes. Okay. So there's three categories here.
Yeah.
There's the non-Western authoritarian kleptocracy. There's the non-Western dictatorship kleptocracy. Yeah. The non-Western kleptocratic dictatorship. There's the non-Western pseudo-democratic kleptocracy, and then there's the Western democracy. I'd say there's three categories here. This is very good. I just reached for this. I'm sitting next to my books. Paul Collier's book, The Bottom Billion, so he deals very well with categories 1 and 2 in there about corruption in autocracies and corruption in corrupt democracies. And he has this great term for the second category, which is the survival of the fattest, and how corruption in quasi-democratic countries, I think Nigeria for me, that's the one of these that I've lived in the longest, and I'm very fond of. But my God, it's turned into a system of survival of the fattest. That's how corruption, where there are sham elections every now and again, can actually be worse in a way, because the patronage system has to be so much bigger and it's so much more unstable that even more public money has to be gobbled to keep that system working, rather than, let's say, Angola, which is a much more narrow dictatorship. It does have its sham elections, but the more this is in contrast to the authoritarian kleptocracies, Saudi Arabia and so on. I've forgotten what the first bit of the question was now. So I got so deep into my categories.
Oh, just making the distinctions. You're doing exactly right. You are.
Yeah, and then the third category obviously is the Western, the Western democracy, and how does that fit in? I think that is the crucial question. I think the way to approach that is to look institution by institution. So, look at the US election just gone. You've had one candidate, Trump, who was, as I show in the book, for years sustained by money from kleptocracies in his kind of ersatz business career, and then nakedly monetized the presidency and then tried to steal the election, just gone. But the candidate he's up against is part of a liberal elite, which by no, is certainly not anywhere near as monstrous as Trump has been, but is still thoroughly plugged into money flows from the former Soviet Union and elsewhere, which it buys influence through the lobbying system, through political donations and so on. This is obviously the world of the Clinton Foundation and so on. And there is no dirty money doesn't favor one ideology over another. It's like mafia money. It probes the political system across the waterfront, looking for human weakness and human greed. And we can see increasingly, I talked earlier about the political donations in the UK. My God, you can see it in France as well, certainly. And Germany, look at the Nord Stream lobbying and the role of Schroeder and so on. So the political institutions of the Western democracies are under siege. The legal institutions, I've touched on those as well, but I think one of the really striking things you're starting to see is how kleptocrats are manipulating the institutions of Western criminal law to take down their enemies. So we've got to pay a lot of attention to things like unexplained wealth orders and who they are targeting, because every time you enact a Magnitsky sanction, an unexplained wealth order, or whatever they may be, important, useful tools though these are, surely you've got to think to yourself, is all you're really doing putting your finger on the scales of kleptocratic power, favoring one faction over another? I'm hearing about attempts whereby private intelligence agencies will be used to target, let's say, hired by, let's say, oligarch A to go after oligarch B, because oligarch B maybe is getting too many political ambitions or whatever it may be, and oligarch A private intelligence agency, which features a couple of former CIA people, a couple of guys from who used to be in MI6, and maybe someone from the Metropolitan Police, a couple of lawyers, a couple of PR people, and they will put together their 500-page bundle of overwhelmingly strong evidence of the corruption of oligarch B. None of it fake, all of it hacked probably, and otherwise blagged, and got assembled by God knows what means, but all of it true, because oligarch A and oligarch B are both thoroughly corrupt, and that bundle is plonked down on the desk of the idealistic 25-year-old newly qualified lawyer who's gone to work for the Serious Fraud Office or whatever it may be, who's desperate to strike a blow against the global kleptocracy. And here on her desk is the 500-page report with everything, tied up in a bow, evidence on oligarch B. She'll press ahead. She will freeze assets. She will maybe even get a conviction. Maybe even she'll send oligarch B to jail if the authorities can lay their hands on oligarch B. And oligarch B will deserve to go to jail. But oligarch B has been selected by the kleptocracy for prosecution, and oligarch A has not been. So it's not that the individual prosecution would be unjust. It's that in the bigger picture, it's the criminal system is being manipulated by the kleptocracy, and you can carry on this analysis across other institutions.
We are very nearly out of time. I'd like to end with one quick question about your plans. It's an incredibly unfair thing to do to an author who is just wrapping up a book and promoting it, what your next project will be. But you have 2 books now that have kept you kind of knee deep in the muck. Based on all of your research, do you have your next project in mind?
Well, I mean, I have my most important project, which is at school at the moment. She'll be back in about half an hour. But I'm still doing my gone back onto the staff of the FT. I drop off the staff of the FT for a year or two to write these books, and I'm back on the investigations team there. I've just run another story in the last few days about some profits being diverted from a big pipeline scheme in the former Soviet Union. I'll keep doing that work. I'd like to write a book which is just exists in sort of germ form in my head at the moment, and if I'm more than happy if anyone wants to get in touch and discuss it. I'm fascinated by what happens when corruption meets the information age. I mean, we've touched on it a few times about the importance of information here, but it seems to me no coincidence that our sort of information ecosystem, for want of a less jargony expression, is collapsing at the same time as dirty money is conquering the world. And I think those two things are linked. You know, we even use a term, don't we? This file is corrupted. This information is corrupted. And I'm sort of fascinated by how the propaganda arms of the big kleptocracies and the sort of private propaganda industry in the West are, in pursuit of kleptocratic goals, sort of bringing down the temple of truth, if you like, which is rather well put. Actually, I've never put it like that before. So I use expression like that when I go back to the publishers and trying to beg some more money out of them to have another go.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your incredible research in this book and your fantastic and compelling storytelling.
Oh, well, thanks. I mean, I'm always delighted to be here. And thanks so much for hosting and asking such perceptive questions, which also goes for everyone who asked them.
Tom, thank you very much indeed for your time. Alexandra as well, thank you for your hosting and your questioning and all the rest of it. There was actually one question, Tom, that I'm going to ask you that I was lobbying Alexandra to ask you through the chat box. It's a pretty bleak picture that you have painted. Do you see any grounds for pessimism? For any grounds for optimism? Did you come across anything where you thought, you know what, if we could just do X, Y, or Z, we could begin to turn the tide? I'm not so naive as to suggest we could turn the tide, but begin to turn the tide.
Well, I think that I'd draw a comparison with climate change here. I'd say we shouldn't strike and we shouldn't reach for a false optimism, because I don't think we've got sort of coherent reasons for optimism yet. I think still things are getting worse fast. But what I do think is that we're in a stage of discovery. I mean, this is why the work you're doing at RISI is so important. And there are brilliant journalists, Misha Glenny and so on, who have for a long time been trying to penetrate and articulate this world that I've called Kleptopia, and it has other names, the McMafia world. And we're still in that stage of trying to understand what it is and what it's doing to us and what it's doing to our lives. But I think we are making big strides in that. And I think the term kleptocracy is used pretty freely by some of the people with the greatest amount of influence in Western politics, who before wouldn't have thought about it as a problem at all. And perhaps this question is a few years behind climate change, but as we understand better stories like Rose's, as we understand better the deaths of witnesses in corruption cases, as we see that the danger of kleptocracy is creeping up to our own front doors, I think we'll start to realize, just as we did when we started to see that climate change wasn't some esoteric scientific problem, but something that was going to change our own lives. I think that's when you start to get the political will and the urgency for resistance. What form that would take, I think it's too soon to tell. But I think that for me is actually a very real cause of optimism. That awareness and outrage is growing.
Great. Well, let's hope that in our own individual ways we can continue to help raise that awareness. Obviously, a very easy way of raising your own personal awareness on this topic is to buy Tom's book and indeed get one for a friend for Christmas.
Yes, Tom, if I may, actually, it's I've tried to write it as this kind of thrilling narrative with a big chunk of footnotes at the back for anyone who wants to get really into the nitty-gritty. So it's really best if you buy 2 copies, and therefore you can be reading the main narrative undisturbed and have the notes open at the back. That's just my recommendation.
That's a very good point, because when you kindly sent me a draft earlier in the year, just in time for the first lockdown, which was a PDF, I spent an awful lot of time flipping backwards and forwards on my iPad. So I do indeed remember that. But thank you very much.
Yeah, two copies each is then. Yeah, great.
Righty-ho. Well, that's 2 times 2. But thank you both very much indeed for your time today. We are going to have to wrap up. Thanks as ever to our audience for taking the time to be with us today. And as usual, if you want to follow what we're up to, do follow us on Twitter at CFCS_RUSI and sign up to our newsletter at rusi.org/CFCS. And we are now podcasting our events if you haven't had enough. So do look to our website to find those. So once again, Alexandra and Tom, thank you both so much. And to the attendees out there, again, have a good day, stay well, and see you at our next event soon. Thank you all. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much.